Hello again, and welcome to a financial thought leadership podcast, Banking on Experience, sponsored by CRMNEXT, the banking CRM, where we simplify work, drive growth, and deliver on experience. This podcast is meant to empower individuals working in the financial industry with stories, experiences, and knowledge straight from the source. Please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform, and stay tuned for an awesome show. Hey everybody, thank you for joining another episode of Banking on Experience. I'm your host, James Gilbert. Today we are joined by Jamie Cosgrove. He's the head of financial services at Podium. His prior background, he's spent the last 15 years partnering with banks and credit unions. He also led Salesforce's financial services focus in the US and Canada. Jamie, welcome to the show.
Thank you, James. Pleasure to be here.
Super excited to have you. I love what Podium's doing. If you're not familiar with Podium, please look them up. They do great stuff. Today's topic, though, we're going to be talking about an open dialogue on the word Figital. I love this sort of like play on words because I think that it's something that is going to be bigger and it's going to continue to grow. But before we get into the topic itself, if you're a listener, you always know that I like to ask this of our guests, but let's ask you something really fun. Who's your hero? One. And how would you spend your day outside of work?
Great question. So I'm going to avoid the really cheesy answer, which is like my parents, because they probably have to be my heroes. But look, I grew up in an Irish Catholic household, so it was sort of ingrained in us that John Fitzgerald Kennedy is our hero. But he did do a lot of really good, he created a lot of social programs. So I'd say probably JFK is one of my heroes, just simply because kind of president of the US at a really interesting time and created a lot of really good social welfare programs. So probably JFK.
That's a good one. That's a really good one.
And what do I do outside? What do I do for fun?
Yeah, if you could pick your perfect day outside of work, what would it be?
Yeah, that's a great question. I love, I was recently on a trip I have 3 daughters, with my family in Arizona, and we went on a hike. It was awesome on one of the mountains, Camelback, in Arizona. So I honestly think it would be just doing something outdoors with my family, like a hike, hearing my kids complain about how hot it is and how tired they are. So.
Oh, I love that. We take our kids on hikes all the time. And it's funny because you look at it and you're like, oh yeah, it's a mile hike, no big deal. But then your kids, like, not even 1/5 of the mile in, are like, oh, I can't do it anymore.
Yeah, and to hear other families passing you on the way back, and their kids are saying the exact same thing.
Yeah, and then you have to put your younger kids on your shoulders or carry them, and then you're like, man, I didn't plan for like a hardcore workout.
That's exactly right.
So Jamie, let's get to the topic. Why are you passionate about this word Figital, and let's define it for the audience?
Yeah, so I love that it's actually been coined a phrase, because I think this is as I've supported financial services organizations for the last couple of decades. I think it's funny. It just seems to be one of those trends that just never goes away. This idea of as the demand for more things to be digitized and for things to be more effortless, there's this idea that hey, we want that. We don't want to have to call a human being to process a new account or a new loan. We want to do that digital. But what's really interesting is, I think there was an article I recently read in Harvard Business Review that kind of talked about this idea that everybody went out and spent millions of dollars to digitize their process. And then it turns out for high value types of engagements, people actually at some point want to talk to a person. So I think, so it's the Figital concept is how do I make my digital experience similar to my physical experience, but really how do I inject human beings into that digital experience where it makes sense and where people want to go kind of offline to online and online to offline is how I think about it.
As a marketer, I've been around for a while, and it's interesting because as a marketer, I think for the last 15 years at least, organizations have been trying to figure this out, for sure.
That's true.
I mean, even outside of financial services, I think that people have been trying to figure it out. Like, how do you bridge the gap of human connection with technology? How do you bridge the gap with the omni-channel and bring humans in that? And I think that we're getting to the point where now it's not a want or need, but it's an expectation. And I think businesses, large or not, really figured out or not, like Amazon, have really created that. They've created an expectation that now we have to adopt, and not just, all right, well, we'll get to it when we get to it. It's now the expectation of consumers. So can you talk to the audience a little bit about that expectation? I know that wasn't something that we necessarily were going to talk about, but I do think it's important. Like, from the expectation of what consumers want now, like, how do people just start the process?
Yeah, I think you nailed it. I think, we all have these supercomputers in our pockets now, and it is those applications like a DoorDash, like an Uber, like an Amazon, that just made it really easy to do something. And so now in our personal lives, we have those expectations of, like, that's just the new normal. And I'm a little bit older than you, and I will say that as this, we've talked about this great transfer of wealth that's happening from the baby boomers to the next two generations, and as that trillions of dollars changes hands, it's changing hands to a generation that is digital first, right? Like, my kids are they'll go to the store at Target, and my youngest will look at this red phone that's hanging on the wall and be like, "Dad, what is that?" Right? And they literally don't know what a phone is and don't understand why there's dials. There's literally buttons on that phone. And I just find that stuff really interesting, that the expectation of the younger consumer when it comes to banking and financial services is 1,000% going to be digital. And they're not going to think about, when they make a wealth investment, they're not going to think about, hey, I'm going to go golf with my wealth advisor, or I'm going to go to a physical meeting with my broker. They're going to think, hey, how do I go to Robinhood, or how do I go to Mint or some other application to go think about my investment portfolio? And I think that's really the challenge. I think the challenge is for every institution, you have to be able to kind of feed that new customer, or you'll be disrupted. And so I think for most organizations, it's, how do I enhance the really good service I provide today by creating some form of digital channel that just makes that that physical experience seem very similar to the digital experience, and just as much as possible make it effortless.
So Jamie, traditionally, I think that most organizations, digital, at least most components of digital, are ran through marketing. So you have this omni-channel approach, right? And I think one of the issues that oftentimes I know I've ran into in my career, where I've had to teach people all the time, like, hey, look, that's not the right way to do it, is this spray and pray method, right? We think like, well, we've got to hit these numbers, we've got to hit our lead number and all that other stuff. And so oftentimes people go out there and they run, millions of dollars of ads against a ton of people, and they don't have human interaction. And they're like, oh yeah, we got a 2% click rate.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just not the right way to do it, right? I mean,
No.
I think that one of the things that I think we do pretty well at CRMNEXT is we sort of create these experiences. The people, there's wow moments, there's a personal touch to it. There's a human always involved that's available there for them at any moment, right? Where they can engage with somebody. And I think that's really the key is doing that, because especially in the financial services industry, I think that oftentimes, I know I get this, I get direct mail pieces all the time of like a credit card offer, or hey, refinance with us, all this other stuff. And I'm like, man, really? Like,
yeah,
I'm not looking for any of that. Like, how have you gotten to know me on a personal level? On where's the human interaction in all of that? And if you think about it, it creates massive waste of spend too.
Yep.
So I know that when we had talked prior to doing the podcast, you had mentioned, because I brought it up with you, I said, well, do you feel like, just in general, the financial services industry is behind the times when it comes to technology? And you said you used to believe in that, but you've changed your mind. Tell us why.
Yeah, I think I think in fact, James, I think when you and I spoke about this, we kind of talked about, there's been this, at least for the amount of time I've been involved in financial services and banking specifically, been this idea that the death of the bank branch, right? And it's like that's been predicted for 20 years, and the reality is these branches really aren't going anywhere yet. And so, but yet more and more activity is done on the digital bank branch, not on the physical. So I think one of the real reasons is just because these institutions have embraced this need to go digital. So there has been a significant amount of investment, but I think you're hitting on something that's really important. I saw a statistic from Deloitte that said only about 17% in their last banking year in review, only 17% of institutions say that they've actually got a return on the investments they've made in digitization. Like that's pretty crazy. To your point, like there's a crazy amount of money being spent on making things digital, but it's not necessarily resonating with the consumer. And why is it not resonating? What we've even seen at Podium is a lot of people will come to your physical branch. They will begin the process of applying for a loan or applying for a mortgage or opening a checking account. But like everybody else, we all get busy, right? So what happens when you get 4 questions into this 30 question application and your kid starts yelling at you, or you've got to run to a meeting or what have you? How do you continue to interact with that individual when they physically leave your website or your application process? Wouldn't it be nice if you were able to reach back out to them on the channels that they prefer, whether that's social, whether it's text, whether it's what have you? I mean, I think that's really where this thing has to go, because banks and credit unions, at least in my experience, sell through service, right? And so this idea that, when you go from one product to 2 products, you become kind of sticky to an organization, right? And when you have both a checking account and your mortgage at a bank, you're more sticky to that institution. So that's really nirvana, is when there is interest, how do I ensure that I'm capturing them in real time at that moment, that micro moment when they're in a purchasing habit? How do I make sure I can leverage that and capitalize on that just simply by communicating with them to close the loop on that application process?
There's 2 things that you mentioned that I absolutely love, and by the way, I agree with everything you just said, but there's 2 things in particular that stood out to me. Number 1 is the ability to communicate with them through the preference of their choice.
Yeah, that's right.
This is key. I just think this is so important. I have probably given the story of what I'm about to say like so many times on this podcast, people are probably sick of hearing it, but whatever, I'm going to do it again. But during the pandemic, right, we were banking with a very large bank, one of the biggest ones in the US. And we happened to buy an RV, first-time RV owners. Our financial, our loan was done through a credit union that we had no accounts at. I couldn't talk on the phone. I couldn't go into the branch. I had no time to talk on the phone. And I was like, look, if I'm going to work with you guys, like I need you to meet me like through text and email over the course of like a week. And they did. I ended up switching my entire like portfolio that I had with this big bank over to this credit union because they met me where I needed to be.
That's a great example.
And it wasn't one of those things where like text and email are my preference of communication necessarily. I mean, it is. Like I'd much rather do that over the course of a couple of days where it's like convenient for me and I'm not interrupting my family time, where I hate being on the phone.
Well, and you raised something, James, that's really important, is like I talk to so many people that are purchasing homes. Obviously that market has been crazy since COVID, right? A lot of people are leaving cities, they're moving to suburbs, they're buying a home, maybe they were renting an apartment before. And I would say 2/3 of the people I talk to is like that entire engagement with getting a mortgage was done over text, and not text in an application. It was just a loan officer texting back and forth from their personal phone to the lender, the person who is, getting the mortgage, it was back and forth. Well, the problem with that approach is you lose all that history, right? You lose all that history and experience that is really critical. And imagine if that sort of lived in CRMNEXT or whatever system is capturing those other engagements. I think that's kind of where this thing needs to go, because you just raised a great example. Like, people want to communicate that way. That's
Yep.
how they prefer to communicate. The problem is it's that history gets lost if it's just in your history on your phone and not in some sort of application that you can close the loop on.
Jimmy, I appreciate the plug. I mean, we definitely help solve there, but that's a totally different topic for another
Yeah,
day.
for sure.
There was a second thing that I wanted to call out too that you had mentioned, and that's not just meeting them in the communication preference of their choice, but at the right time. Yep. Right. Using the example that I gave you already, right? Like when they met me during the pandemic was right after I just signed up a brand new RV loan, right? At the right time, they got me and they're like, you know what? Like, let's work with you. And they asked me probing questions like, hey, we're gonna obviously open up a checking account for you automatically because you have a loan with us. But do you have any kids? And I was like, yeah, I've got 4 of them. And I was like, we don't have accounts for them, and we've been looking to open them up, and we've been trying to find an institution for it. And boom, we opened up 4 checking accounts, 4 savings accounts for each one of our kids. Now they have their own debit card. I'm doing financial education through that credit union. I mean, the timing of it all really does matter. And I think that to do that well, you have to have touches set up that bring in a human, that are somewhat automated so that you don't miss them and that the human error isn't there. And you've got to make sure that it is omnichannel. And I think those 3 things are super important for financial institutions. And the other thing that you talked about before we got on the podcast was digital innovation. So how does that play a role?
Yeah, I think, again, this is a little bit of the sort of recognition that happened in the last year and a half. Is I think most organizations in financial services and elsewhere were already preparing. Obviously, people knew that this is where kind of where the market was heading, was the need to make things easier, make things digital. I think COVID hit and it just put everything on light speed, right? Like, suddenly people couldn't physically go into a bank branch or into anything physically anywhere. And so I think the rate at which now people had to sort of stop everything, figure out ways to do the simplest things, even just to update what their bank hours were or what their policies were, or what could I actually physically go into a bank or not? It was just that communication just became critically more important. And I think, what I've seen is just there's been a fundamental shift in every industry, in the sense that now, that could happen again, and it could happen at any time. And, I always think about, in terms of what happened, for me or for anybody, it was the simplest thing of, one of my kids needed shin guards for soccer, and COVID hits, and you've got to order it online and then go pick it up. Well, Dick's didn't exactly have technology in place that would allow you to communicate to people that would pull up in the line and do curbside pickup, right? So like it was send them an email, call this phone number, and it's just not a great experience, right? So I think more than anything, the what COVID caused was this recognition, like, holy cow, we just operationally don't have the right things in place to if there is a disaster like that, for us to kind of think about how do we reach our clients. And it's not in the avenues that people now want to talk through, right? It was through emails and phone calls and websites posted, but it was not personal, it was impersonal, and it was not specific, right? And so I think that's the thing that I've seen change the most over the last year and a half, is holy cow, we got to have these things in place, because I'll use just credit unions as an example. Credit unions traditionally have been really, really good at service, And that's how they've been able to sort of outflank banks, these big banks, is just by providing better service. Well, suddenly, they didn't have the ability to reach their members the way they previously did. And so I think it was the need to, holy cow, we got to put these measures in place just to communicate with them, whether that's an existing customer or member or a new customer or new member.
Let's double down on that for a little bit. We're going to end on this question. You're very familiar with this space, like you've been in it a long time. So what are some challenges that you've seen specifically related to this? And how do you think that financial institutions solve for it?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, I love to think about this and kind of geek out on it. To be honest, it's so you've talked about sort of this dynamic of a marketer's responsibility. It was always the marketer's responsibility to go invest in these channels, these new channels that people wanted to communicate on, and it was sort of you go figure out, spray and pray. You go figure out how to get more people to come in, physically come in or digitally come in. And I think one of the areas that I've just seen a significant shift in the last 6 months is this idea of attribution, right? Is where did somebody come in? Where did they maybe fall out of the process? Where did they continue? Why did they continue? And I think that even that was a traditional marketing responsibility, is go figure out this attribution of what our prospects are and how we converted, how many of them did we convert. And so we're just seeing in the market now a significant desire by bank executives, by financial institution executives to say, I want to know everything about where somebody came to us. How did they come through social? Did they come through a direct mailing campaign? Were they a referral? And then actually attribute that back to, okay, we made this investment in technology, some sort of technology, but what's the so what behind it? What's the actual dollars that I can attribute back to that? And how many more loans did I close because of it? Or how many more accounts did I close? And it's now it's no longer the responsibility just of the marketing team. It's now the responsibility of everybody to go figure that out, because everybody's fighting for the same dollar. And I think that becomes critically more important, as we talked about, as Generation Y and Generation Z come into wealth and they come into, buying their first home, having their first account, it becomes even more important. It's table stakes now at this point, that they have the ability to attribute, where are we getting our clients from, our members from, how are they feeling about the experience? It's so much so that I was talking to a bank executive the other day, and they look at large withdrawals that happen with no other activity 30 days after that withdrawal. Like, okay, somebody just took a large sum of money out and we haven't seen any other activity. They're probably a risk to leave our organization. So I think everybody's critically sensitive now to, I got to make sure I understand how people are coming in, and more importantly, why they're not closing the transaction. And that's probably the one trend more than any that I'm seeing everybody's feverishly scrambling to go solve for.
It's interesting because it brings me back to some of the experience that I had in the customer experience space. And we used to call it, rather than attribution, we would call it journey analytics, which is very similar. Like there's attribution built throughout it, but really understanding the entire journey of a customer and a member, from the time in which they very first engage with your brand and everything in between. And I think for far too long, I would go to say that I still think this is a major problem. I mean, I have arguments about this with other marketers. Like, the middle stuff matters more than first and last, I promise you.
Yep.
And the middle stuff is what's doing the influence. The middle stuff is what is really making a difference in their decision making. And sometimes the middle stuff is what we oftentimes have as the greatest engagement too, where humans are involved. It's very rare that a human is going to create that first touch or last touch, especially in today's world, but humans are always part of the middle, and they never get the attribution there. And I think that, to your point, organizations have to do this cross-functionally. It can't just be a marketing's job. It's got to be cross-functional alignment to figure out, let's map the journey out. I mean, spending the time in the customer experience space that I did, number one is where everyone started when they wanted to do real true customer experience or member experience for that matter, was journey map. You start there. It's an executive alignment exercise, gets everybody to understand, hey, this is what marketing is doing. This is what sales is doing. This is what customer success is doing. Oh, where's the handoffs? Where's the gaps?
Yeah.
As an executive, when you start to understand that full journey of the entire life cycle of a customer and member, that is where the bread and butter is. And
Yeah,
that's
I think that's where those, I think that's well said. And I think it's where those aha moments come from.
yeah,
We all know that, we, like, there's a lot of us that have a single account with an institution, but we're out acquiring other services, and we're just not thinking about the institution where we already go, because they're not thinking about us and they're not reaching out to us and capturing us. And so I think it's really well said that it's cross-functional, it's everybody's responsibility, and it's becoming table stakes.
completely agree. Jamie, we're at time, but there's two things I'd like you to end on. Where can people reach you? And tell us a quick bit about Podium.
Yeah, just a 30-second view is Podium is a reputation management company. What we do for financial institutions is effectively solve a sort of age-old problem, which is for your organization to get found, right? Like 90% of all investigations still happens on search. It generally happens in Google. That's kind of where we start the journey. And then we're able to sort of bring some of the things that we've talked about today is the first challenge is get noticed. The second challenge is, now that you've been noticed, how do I interact with you the way you want to get activated? For us, our hypothesis is it's messaging. So that's what Podium does for banks, credit unions, and financial institutions. Best way to get a hold of me is it's Jamie. Feel free to email me at jamie.cosgrove, jamie.cosgrove@podium.com. Happy to answer any questions you might have. Feel free to hit me up on LinkedIn or Twitter as well. But I really appreciate this time, James. This has been a lot of fun.
Jamie, thank you so much for having us. And we really do mean this. Like, anything that we can do to help support you, and anything that we can help support credit unions or community banks in the industry, please reach out to us. We would love to hear from you. We really do mean it. We're here to serve, and that's what we want to do.
Great. Thank you.